As the Iran war is now being counted in weeks, there is an increasing discussion of how long the United States can keep this going. However, I think there are a couple of critical misconceptions about what is happening here, one on a practical level and one on a strategic level. So today, I want to clarify where things stand. That means 1. Explaining how the United States has effectively socialized the costs of war, creating a gap between who pays for the war and who decides whether the war continues. I do not think that this is cause for great optimism for the United States, but the situation is not as dramatic as the public discourse often suggests, though acknowledging the problem certainly clarifies that the situation is worse for everyone living outside of the states. And it also tells us something important about the risk of the PRC invading Taiwan in the future. The second general category of clarification is that the war is not entirely about who will quit first. It is also about how to best shape a negotiated settlement should the Iranian government not collapse in the meantime. And there, the United States is placing significant physical constraints on what Iran can do in the future. But let me begin by briefly summarizing the basic problem that the United States appears to have. We have discussed before the central concern inside of the Pentagon that U.S. stockpiles are not in a good position. Thus, if the White House would like to have something left over to deter the PRC from invading Taiwan over the next few years, the U.S. military cannot keep firing forever. However, with the Strait of Hormuz closing, the public conversation has shifted from a matter of metal, M-E-T-A-L, to a matter of metal, M-E-T-T-L-E, and this runs on both sides of the equation. For the United States, the problem boils down to Main Street economic concerns. Suffering 13 casualties over more than 2 weeks of fighting is not a political problem, not to take anything away from their families' losses. By comparison, the United States suffered 196 fatalities during the invasion of Iraq, and about 4,500 in total when we add in the much longer period of insurgency. Nor is anyone on Main Street paying close attention to METAL stockpiles. It is fun for all of us to live in our national security bubbles, but it helps to touch grass every now and then. And it is great that if you are watching this video, then you probably have a good sense of the economic calamity that the invasion of Taiwan would cause. But that is all very abstract to people working full-time and wondering how to pay the bills at the end of the month. To borrow a phrase from long ago, it's the economy, stupid. And to the extent that anything can rein in Trump's adventurism, it is an affordability crisis in America. Emphasis on the "in America" part. This is purely a problem of inflation due to surging oil prices, up about $27 per barrel as I write this video, which translates to about 67 cents per gallon at the pump. It is the most visible of price hikes, and it will turn the American public against the war. Or, more precisely, it will turn more of the American public against the war. Your average American may not be a fan of the former Ayatollah, but they also may not see clear utility in eliminating him. They do see clear disutility in spending more on everything. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the Iranian government fighting for its survival. The United States unambiguously is trying to dismantle the Iranian state apparatus, and implicitly trying to entice Iranian citizens to turn against their government. In other words, the Islamic Republic has no choice but to care deeply about the outcome of this war. The whole thing gives off vibes like Vietnam, where one side wins not because it is more powerful, but because it cares more about the stakes. Hence, much of the public discourse wonders whether the United States can exit this war with anything that comes close to resembling a win. Now, this intuition captures something central to crisis bargaining incentives. Remember how when we illustrate the costs of war, I am often careful to describe those as the physical costs weighed by how much the parties care about the substantive stakes at hand. Literally, the mathematical way to construct the costs is the physical cost divided by the valuation of the prize. Quick reminder, I am an actual professor and an actual game theorist, except no substitutes. So if the United States cares little about the substantive outcome, the mapping of its costs appears inflated. On the other hand, if Iran prioritized state survival like nothing else, its internalized costs become vanishingly small. This, in short, is why prosecuting these wars is so difficult for a country like the United States. The stakes imply a bad starting position. That said, some of the discussion surrounding the war overstates the cost situation for the White House. If nothing else, the Trump administration has succeeded in passing along a substantial portion of the costs of the war to others. And while Main Street Americans do internalize those aforementioned higher prices, they do not internalize the broader globalized costs. This payer-decider gap is most apparent in the consequences of the Strait of Hormuz shutdown. Gas prices will increase about 67 cents per gallon. That is an amount for everyone, not just Americans. The United States consumes about 20% of the world's oil production, meaning that Americans will incur about 20% of the direct consequences of higher fuel consumption. I have to add the direct qualifier there, because the American share of consumption beyond gasoline is a bit higher by percentage, and inflated gas prices will have knock-on effects for the rest of those purchases. Either way, though, Americans are not eating the majority of the consequences here. In fact, the United States is a net oil exporter. All of the associated companies benefit from the higher prices. Essentially, if you had no business interests in the Gulf, then the war has deleted about 20% of your competition. As a result, oil company stocks are near all-time highs. Compare that to a country like China, which consumes 16% of the world's oil production, but must import 70% of that total. The net economic impact there is more substantial, and this is actually a strategic gain for the United States. And also keep in mind that if the United States ever switches its strategy to actively disable Iran's oil infrastructure, that remains a bilateral gain in the US-China security relationship. Or how about Cuba, a country already facing a de facto oil embargo? Countries were previously reluctant to send oil there. Post-Hormuz closure, they have virtually no incentive to do so when the barrels command higher prices around the world. Now you have a situation where the country has literally gone dark, and the black market price for a gallon of gasoline is about $35, in a place where average monthly wages might be $20 to $25. Like China, though, this is not a cost to the United States. It is a benefit. Regional partners are bearing greater military costs by virtue of being within range of Iranian drones. This, again, is not directly a cost that the White House internalizes. Ukraine will soon have to deal with a Kremlin that has received an economic windfall at a time when finances were finally starting to get tight. Once more, this is not directly a cost that the White House internalizes. Is this a good way to win fans in the international system? Absolutely not. But then again, when has that ever been a serious priority for the Trump administration? America First is not just a catchphrase. It is a real policy. The key practical takeaway here is that a payer-decider gap is dictating the outcome of the war. The payer is basically everyone. The decider is just the person sitting in the White House. So when you think about the costs of the war for the United States, it is important to conceptually think about the costs of the war for the United States, because it is easy to fall into a trap and think that the US costs of the war extend all the way out to here due to all of those problems. But if the Trump administration only cares directly about what is happening in the United States, the situation does not look as dire, at least in bilateral negotiations. Do not jump to the conclusion that the United States is in a bad bargaining position against Iran because the rest of the world is on fire. Of course, what this says about US relations with traditional partners is a different story. Indeed, the negative externalities imposed on other countries is creating an interesting geopolitical dynamic. Yesterday, Trump was discussing the importance of other countries assisting the United States in reopening the Strait of Hormuz. This goes beyond the demining question that we discussed a few days ago, and now extends to providing escorts for tankers sailing through the region. The general global reaction has been dismissive. This is a sensible sentiment on the surface. The United States created the problem. It is therefore up to the United States to fix the problem. You break it, you buy it. NATO countries in particular are looking at the situation and explicitly responding with a "not my job." It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the military crisis is occurring in the Middle East, which, last I looked, is not in the North Atlantic. However, the broader resistance runs up against the reality that other countries are suffering the consequences, and the United States still only internalizes a fraction of the costs. Even if we are at a stalemate for now, it is plausible to think that eventually a coalition of countries will relent and begin that process. We are already seeing headlines like that, with Japan considering using naval forces to ensure access to oil. That is definitely something that I've never heard before. Still, this will not magically form overnight. It has all the trappings of a collective action problem. Oil passing through the strait creates a public good, because the additional supply lowers prices for everyone. But that gives individual countries less incentive to participate. Participation is costly, not only for the deployment of the vessels, but also due to the real risk that they will come under fire. Meanwhile, the participants only internalize a fraction of the benefits. As a result, this mess may continue for a long time. I think it is worth briefly discussing a parallel problem to this, which is the next domino at risk of falling. It is also what would take the situation into real World War III territory. What I am referring to, of course, is a PRC invasion of Taiwan. That might be a serious concern right now if Beijing had enough landing craft, which does not seem to be the case. Yet. The connection here is that any invasion would doom Taiwan's semiconductor industry. That would spiral the global economy into the greatest recession, or perhaps worse. Consequently, if there were a planner for the global economy, he would put this near the top of the list of things not to do. The problem is that Beijing would only suffer a fraction of the consequences. And if Xi Jinping is the only one directly making the decision, then the rest of those economic consequences may matter little in what actually happens. The payer-decider gap strikes again. We are also getting hints of a collective action problem limiting the feasibility of the solution. If the PRC might pass along great costs to everyone else, the solution is for everyone else to band together to deter an invasion. Once more, though, the contributions that any individual country makes will generate little direct benefit for that particular country. This creates a strong free-riding incentive, an under-provision of Taiwanese security, and the possibility that Beijing might try its luck in a few years. Circling back to Iran, the other misconception about the cost situation is that this is some kind of attritional battle that will only end with total victory for one side. That would mean the fall of the Iranian government or the United States giving up and leaving. However, that is not what war termination usually looks like, and it is hard to see how half of that could even come to pass. Substantively speaking, the United States is not literally seeking Iranian territory as this graphic depicts. The policy goal is to limit Iran's geopolitical influence in the region. Obviously, that is easier to do if the Iranian government no longer exists, which is the US goal for the war. But failing that, the United States and Israel have succeeded in making a huge dent in Iran's military capacity. It is therefore hard to see a situation where Tehran is a major regional player coming out of the conflict, at least until many years have passed. Comparisons to Vietnam fall flat, not only because the United States does not have boots on the ground, but also because Washington seeks policy goals that extend past the Iranian borders, and the mere degradation of Iran's military facilitates those policy goals. Now, how much extra Washington could extract out of Iran depends on each side's commitment to the war. And even with a significant portion of the cost passed on to the rest of the world, the White House must still deal with the real political ramifications of higher gas prices. I can see this breaking in one of two ways. Possibility one is that Trump does not care at all about what happens in upcoming elections. He is term limited in 2028, and he might not care about the long-term success of the Republican Party. He therefore does not directly care about the 2026 midterm elections, and so he continues the war at its current pace. In all likelihood, a blue wave sweeps into power, and Congress begins to use the power of the purse to rein in Trump come January 2027. In the meantime, Republicans in Congress are in an awful position. Anyone in a swing district will lose, but they also worry that trying to rein in Trump now will cause the president to turn on them, guaranteeing their loss for a different reason. Better then to write it out and hope something goes well in the war. Visually, this is like saying that the average American may view the cost of war like this, but Trump does not care what they think. Trump actually views the cost of war like this because he internalizes few consequences if he is abandoning his electoral prospects anyway. The payer-decider gap strikes again. The second way that this could break is that Trump does care about what is happening on the electoral front, and so the administration must make a decision about the trade-offs of further attriting Iranian power versus running up the cost tab. That goes double if Iran could muster an attack on the US homeland, something that we have discussed before is a serious security concern. That would indeed result in Iran having a stronger bargaining position. Keep in mind, in either case, we are thinking about how this gets resolved in coercive negotiations. So even if Trump is willing to take the war past the midterm elections, that does not mean that he will. Rather, Iran internalizes how that affects the outcome of the war and then bases negotiations around that. You may see a couple of deeper problems here. 1. Room for negotiation presupposes that the underlying chance of domestic rebellion has subsided, so the window has closed on the war of opportunity for the United States. And 2, I just suggested that there could be 2 different types of possible Trump administrations, each with a unique level of commitment to continue the war. If it is not obvious to Iran which is the real level of commitment, then you have a classic private information bargaining friction, and a ticket for the war to continue until that gets resolved. In a word, it is a mess. Well, I think I have done enough to make the fog of war worse today. Perhaps consider watching another video on the conflict in the Middle East that may try to provide some clarity instead. Despite that, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.